Welcome everybody to the Geeking Poetic channel. I'm your host Larry Roberts, and this is a roundup of all the cool rock history from the month of April. Now, if long-form videos like this aren't quite your thing, then don't worry, because we have a bunch of 1-minute shorts that we do every week where we talk about this week in rock history. You can check those out on YouTube as well as on TikTok and Instagram. And while you're at it, please make sure you hit that subscribe button below so that you can be notified when all our new content comes out. And alright, without any further ado, let's get into some rock history. Now, earlier this month, we focused on a classic album that was released right at the end of March and hit the charts in April 1976. And this album wound up being a huge breakthrough for the band that made it. I'm talking about Thin Lizzy, and the album is Jailbreak. This week in rock history, we're looking at a truly classic rock masterpiece. None other than Thin Lizzy's Jailbreak. Released in March 1976, this was the record that finally saw Thin Lizzy get the success and respect that they deserved. When Phil Lynott and drummer Brian Downey added guitarist Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson into the fold in 1974, they'd worked hard to make a dent on the music charts, but previous records Nightlife and Fighting didn't make the mark they'd hoped for. But with songs like Emerald, Cowboy Song, and the title track, they showed that they could create memorable hard-rocking music worthy of airplay and stadium concerts everywhere. And with the breakout hit single The Boys Are Back in Town, Thin Lizzy showed that they had both the songwriting and musical chops to become loved by fans around the world. Do you have this album? What's your favorite song on Jailbreak? Let us know. Man, Jailbreak is such a great album. It's one of my all-time favorites, and honestly, it's really hard to just pick one favorite song off of that album. But if I'm really pressed, I'm gonna go with a deep cut, and I'm gonna mention the song Angel from the Coast. If you're not familiar with that song, make sure you go and listen to it. It has some of the best guitar work on the whole album. Moving on to another album that was released in the month of April, except this time it's the year 1980, we take a look at the heavy metal classic that is British Steel by the band Judas Priest. This week in rock history, we're highlighting one of the most important metal albums ever. None other than Judas Priest's British Steel. Released in April of 1980, British Steel saw the band really establishing themselves as a force to be reckoned with for the new decade. The band had been steadily building up a following and progressing with each album for years, but this album took a huge leap forward with a metal sound that felt fresh and reinvigorated. Songs like Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight, and Metal Gods showed that Priest could be aggressive and heavy, but also write bona fide hits worthy of arena stages worldwide. Rob Halford's voice was as strong as ever, and the dual guitar attack of KK Downing and Glenn Tipton was tight and heavy. And as such, this album had a massive influence on the metal scene that was about to explode into the 1980s. Do you have this album? What's your favorite track? Let us know. Now, while I'm a fan of pretty much all Judas Priest, I'm particularly fond of the 1970s stuff, but I do have to say that this album was the album that got me into Priest when I was a kid, so I gotta give it props. But, you know, I gotta say it's crazy when I look at the month of April in 1980, just how many great metal albums came out that month. Because not only did you have British Steel, you had the debut of Iron Maiden, you had Witchfind, you had Motorhead. There was so much good stuff that came out, and this next one is no exception. I'm talking about the first album featuring Ronnie James Dio as the lead singer of Black Sabbath. This week in rock history, we're looking at a game-changing album for the band Black Sabbath. None other than Heaven and Hell. Released in April of 1980, this was the first Sabbath album to feature new vocalist Ronnie James Dio, who'd made a name for himself previously as the powerhouse vocalist of Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. Choosing Ronnie as a replacement for the ousted Ozzy Osbourne was a controversial move at the time. However, when people heard Heaven and Hell, they discovered that this was a very new Sabbath. Songs like Neon Nights, Die Young, and the title track featured the unmistakable riffing of Tony Iommi, but with a new edge and vibe to it that really was suited for Dio's vocal style. And it showed that this wasn't a band that was going to just rest on its past glories. Black Sabbath was ready to forge ahead into the 1980s. What do you think of the Dio-era Sabbath? Do you like this album? Let us know. So as you can see, the decade of the 1980s really got off to a heavy start. But not only overseas in the UK, but right here in the States as well, when you had bands such as Van Halen upping their game and getting even heavier with their fourth album, Fair Warning. This week in rock history, we look at the fourth album by the legendary Van Halen, none other than Fair Warning. Released in April of 1981, Fair Warning saw the band shifting slightly into a darker and grittier sound, with songs like Mean Street, Sinner's Swing, and the incredibly heavy yet anthemic Unchained. Now, while many Van Halen fans look back on this album with fondness today, it's worth noting that the album was seen as a little bit of a letdown when it was first released. And ultimately, it was the one that sold the least amount of copies from the David Lee Roth era, though it still went double platinum. And it still managed to make the top 5 on the record charts. Nowadays, some of the songs and riffs from this album remain absolute classics and are considered by many to be some of the best stuff that Van Halen ever did. Do you love this album, or did you think this was a letdown too? Let us know. Man, that's such a great heavy album for April of 1981, and I think it's safe to say that even though it influenced old guys like me, Van Halen and that album in particular are continuing to influence players even today. And the fact that there's young guitar players that are still discovering and getting into Eddie Van Halen is really something. All right, well, we're going to set the Wayback Machine a little bit further back now to April of 1971. And that month saw the release of one of this band's most influential and highly regarded albums that they ever made. And honestly, given the amazing amount of music that this band has made for the last 6 decades or so, that really says something. Who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the album Sticky Fingers by the legends, the Rolling Stones. This week in rock history, we're focusing on a landmark album that was released 53 years ago, none other than Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. This marked the first full studio album appearance by guitarist Mick Taylor, who'd replaced Brian Jones after his death in 1969. And Mick's playing along with Keith Richards' guitar work is phenomenal throughout this whole album, along with Bill and Charlie's solid rhythm section and Mick Jagger's iconic swagger, with songs like Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, Dead Flowers, and Can't You Hear Me Knocking, leaning heavily into southern fried bluesy rock without much of the bells and whistles that were predominant on previous albums. The cover artwork was designed by Andy Warhol, and it's as iconic as the music on the record itself, though that alternate Spanish cover is really interesting, albeit slightly disturbing. A #1 album in both the US and the UK, this is arguably one of the most important albums in rock history. Do you agree? Let us know. Yeah, and this is another one of those albums where I don't know if I can pick a favorite. It's one of those like no skip albums where I will listen to it from front to back. I don't skip any songs on there. They're all classics. But if you have a favorite song off of Sticky Fingers, don't hesitate to leave a comment and let me know. All right, well, now moving on to something a little bit more salacious and controversial. We're looking at a song that was released back in April of 1984, and it wound up being one of the most controversial songs of the decade. Not only because of the way it was received by the public and the critics, but also because it drew the attention of a bunch of Washington wives who set out to censor and try to control what people were and weren't allowed to listen to. Yep, I'm talking about the PMRC, and the song I'm talking about is Animal, the first single by the heavy metal shock rock band Wasp. This week in rock history, we look at the 40th anniversary of one of the most infamous and controversial songs of the 1980s, none other than the Animal single by Wasp. The song was originally slated to be the opening track on their debut album, but Capitol Records got cold feet about the song, worried that it would cause the album to be banned or have distribution problems. However, the band knew that this song needed to be released, so they struck up a deal with the smaller label Music for Nations and released it as a single over in the UK in April of 1984. With its overtly sexual and profanity-laced lyrics, it ensured that the record was a hit with metal audiences. And it did indeed cause controversy upon release, famously making the PMRC's list of records that they felt were a harmful influence on listeners. Blackie Lawless announced in 2006 that he wouldn't play the song live anymore, but recently he has started to revisit it again. Do you remember this song? Now, yeah, when that record first came out and it was available over here in the States, I immediately went out and bought it. And yeah, I admit, I loved that record. You know, I was a young kid, and anything that was controversial and heavy like that, I had to have it. But I gotta be honest with you, I still think it's a pretty good song. It's got a great hook, and the guitars are awesome on that song. Now, another breakthrough record that came out in the month of April, this time in the year 1976, came from four guys from New York City. And this record was maybe a little bit controversial in its own way too, but more so because it was presenting a sound and a style that by and large was new to most people that heard it. And as such, it ended up introducing a good portion of the public to what became known as punk rock. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the debut release from the band, the Ramones. This week in rock history, we're celebrating the 48th anniversary of the debut album by the Ramones. Released in April 1976, this album was recorded in only 7 days, and it stripped down songs with buzzsaw guitars from Johnny, Tommy's intense drumming, along with Joey and Dee Dee's ability to write songs that were both fun and clever, really stood out, ultimately becoming many people's introduction to what would be known as punk rock. This record went on to influence so many bands and artists over the years. Ironic, given that the record didn't perform well commercially upon release. But songs like Blitzkrieg Bop, Judy is a Punk, and 53rd and 3rd garnered lots of critical praise, and eventually would be on many lists of the greatest albums of all time. Sadly, now every member of this lineup has now passed on, but at least we still have the music to enjoy. What's your favorite song on this record? Let us know. Man, that debut Ramones record is so great, and I gotta say, it's got a timeless quality to it because I still encounter young people today that are discovering the Ramones and they love it. And I still hear young bands now that are carrying a lot of Ramones influence in their music. Man, it's great that it carries on after all these years. Well, we can't wrap all this up without mentioning a couple of legendary artists who sadly passed away during the month of April. First up, we're looking at one of the biggest breakout artists from the 1990s, whose lyrics and haunting voice still resonates with listeners even today. And I'm talking about vocalist Layne Staley from the band Alice in Chains. This week in rock history, we look back on one of the most distinctive and enigmatic vocalists of our time, none other than Alice in Chains frontman Layne Staley. They were one of the first Seattle bands from the late 80s to get a major label deal, and they saw success with their debut album Facelift in 1990. The band's tight and heavy rhythm section, combined with Jerry Cantrell's catchy yet incredibly heavy and moody riffs, certainly caught people's attention. But it was the voice and presence of vocalist Layne Staley that truly helped the band stand out. He could easily switch between being explosively aggressive to being ethereal and haunting, and his sense of melody as well as his harmonies with Cantrell gave the band a sound and style that was certainly all their own. Sadly, Layne's demons continued to hold him back. He last performed live with the band in 1996, and by April 5th, 2002, the world lost one of the best artists of the 20th century. And lastly, we're going to look at a legendary guitarist who not only struck fame playing with some really important artists, but was also responsible for writing some of the biggest hits and best hooks around, with a style and sound that many other players have duplicated in the years since. I'm talking about former David Bowie and Ian Hunter guitar player Mick Ronson. This week in rock history, we're remembering one of the most electric and influential guitarists, none other than guitarist Mick Ronson. He grew up in England and became a staple on the British underground music scene, almost considered giving up after struggling for years, until he was offered a chance to work with upcoming artist David Bowie in early 1970. He went on to become a member of Bowie's band, making his mark especially during the Ziggy Stardust era, not only as a lead guitarist but also multi-instrumentalist and string arranger. His charisma and energy on stage were a perfect match for Bowie, and as such he influenced many young players for years to come. Later on, he teamed up with Ian Hunter for a string of hits, and he even helped John Mellencamp create the classic Jack and Diane, not to mention occasionally working with Bowie again. Sadly, Mick passed away at only 46 years old from cancer, but his influence and songs are still loved and appreciated even today. Well, that about wraps it up for this month in rock history for April. It goes without saying that there's a lot of other great rock history that we didn't even touch on this month. And, you know, if there's something that you felt we should have talked about, again, please let us know in the comments. But don't fret, because we're going to be revisiting this month and future months over and over again. We have a lot of content coming up. We'll be back soon with more rock history facts for the month of May. But in the meantime, again, make sure you hit the like, hit the subscribe button so that you can be notified as soon as we have new stuff live for you to check out. Every week we'll have new shorts, and then at the end of the month, just like this, we're going to do another monthly roundup. Go check us out on Facebook. We have a group over there called the Geeking Squad where we talk about music, videos, movies, toys, all kinds of geeky stuff. Plus, you can follow us on TikTok and Instagram. And you can listen to us on just about every podcasting platform there is. In the meantime, keep listening to great music, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.